Hello and welcome to the build video for my Xinshi Sturmtiger. This model is a bit different to what I usually like to build, but it's a great model to practice some scratch build and modification techniques. A couple of years ago I read an article on the Modelling News website where they built the same model, and since then I always wanted to try it myself. This company has a few other tanks in the same style. My wife also built one which you can see on her channel. I will have a link in the description. The first thing I did was to remove the fenders and bolts on the side of the hull. To do this I used some side cutters to remove the majority of them, then I sanded down until it was flat. I won't need to completely remove the scratch marks as I plan to add the rolled steel texture later. Next I assembled the first part of the gun and fitted it into place. It has a metal part that keeps the gun in position whilst allowing it to be movable. I then removed the fenders before fitting all of the main parts of the tank together. This model doesn't require any glue and the parts will snap into place, but it does require a bit of force sometimes. The shape of the gun shield didn't match what I had seen in my references, so I used a rotary tool to shave it to the correct shape. Also in the reference pictures I saw that there were marks along the round part of the barrel. I scraped a knife along the side to recreate this. The outside edge of the end of the barrel is much higher than the other parts. I wanted it to be flat so that it would match the real tank more accurately, so I just used a sanding stick to do this. Next I marked locations to add the gas vent holes with a pen. Then I drilled them out with a small drill. The two parts of the gun were then glued together. It does snap together, but I didn't want it to come apart later. Next I added cast texture to all of the parts of the tank that need it. This process is quite simple. I first use a brush to spread Tamiya extra thin glue over the part that I want to add the texture. Then I dab the brush onto the surface to add the uneven cast texture. The glue and dabbing process is repeated until the texture is good. More layers will make a rougher surface. The cast texture was also applied to the gun shield. I then added flame cut marks to the end of the barrel. This was done by cutting marks along the part with the knife tilted in one direction. Then I repeat it for the other direction. Afterwards I clean off the excess and spread over some extra thin to soften the edges. The driver's vision port is just a block, so of course I wanted to add more detail to it. I started by drilling out holes on either side for where the glass would go. Then I used a rotary tool to carve out holes. Finally I used a knife to cut out the corners to give it the square shape. Next I wanted to add a cover for it, so I started by cutting out a rectangle shape from some metal sheet. I checked the width by just holding it in position, seeing if it should be narrower. Once I'm happy with the width, I bend one end 90 degrees. Then again I place it in position and mark where to make the next bend. I start trimming the edges so that the cover fits correctly and trim until I get the desired shape. Then I fix it in place with superglue. The whole machine gun has a solid rounded end. I wanted to make this a little bit more realistic, so I sanded down the end until it was flat and drilled a hole. The MG port also received the cast texture, applied in the same way as before. The handles on the top patch are just blocks in the kit, so they should be replaced. I cut them off and clean up the area. Next I mark out where the holes will go and then drill them out. After this I bend some wire of the desired thickness into shape and fit it into place. The handles are fixed into position with superglue. This is the end result. I think it looks much better than before. I created the mounts for the fenders by cutting some thin strips of plastic sheet. I wanted to add some holes into them to represent where the screw holes would have been. I measured and marked out the position with a ruler and a pen, then used a small drill to create them. This process was repeated for the side skirts. I worked out the position with a ruler, then made marks of where to put the attachment points. These were made with some thin plastic sheet cut into small squares. After they are fitted I used a drill again to create a hole in each. Now I wanted to start improving the pistol ports, or at least I think these are pistol ports. Please let me know if I am wrong and what they actually are. I start by drilling out a hole with the largest drill bit I have, but it's still a little small, so I widen it with a knife. Then I use a mini drill to smoothen it. After this I use a sanding stick to remove the remaining parts. I don't need to worry about making it perfectly smooth as I will cover it later with rolled steel texture. Next are the holders on the side of the tank. To recreate this I used some metal sheet cut into strips and bent 90 degrees. These are glued on with CA glue and once dry I bend them the other way and then remove the excess of the parts with some scissors. After this I added the rolled steel texture to all of the armor plates. To do this I used Tamiya basic putty mixed with varying amounts of extra thin glue. The first layer was applied to prepare for the upcoming layers. It shouldn't be too thick or too thin, somewhere in the middle. Next I added a thick layer to create the texture, and finally a thin layer to blend it together and smoothen it. Once it has completely dried, I use a very fine sanding sponge to smooth it and make it more flat. Going back to the pistol ports, I used some old sprue to create the plug. They were just cut out and sanded into shape. Then I drilled a small hole into the top, and into this I glued some chain. I added flame cut marks along the edge of the armor plates in the usual way, by doing it one pass with the blade tilted in one direction and another in the opposite, then smoothing it with extra thin glue. The Sturmtiger has some bolts along the sides and front of the tank. Meng has a range of shapes that you can use for the nuts and bolts. Unfortunately, at the time I couldn't get the exact ones that I wanted, but the ones that I did choose still look good. I cut them off carefully with sharp side cutters before gluing them in place with Tamiya glue. For the bolts on the side, I can use the existing kit parts to determine the position, but for the front I had to measure them out. The next part to get modified was the exhaust, as the part in the kit is completely solid. I started by chopping a part off the top and then sanding it down. Next I had a look through my spare parts for a disc that I could use as the top of the exhaust. I drilled several holes through it and then pushed some metal rod through. This was then fitted to the main exhaust part and the excess was trimmed off. This is the end result. I think it looks a lot better than before. Now for the exhaust covers. These are quite thick, so I used a mini drill to sand them down a bit. I recently bought some trumpeter Zimmerit tools, so I thought this would be a good model to practice them on. I marked out the area where I wanted to apply the Zimmerit with a pencil. In hindsight, I think it would have been better to cover a bigger area. I spread Tamiya 2-part putty over the marked areas with the end of a paintbrush. To stop it from sticking, I dampen it with water. Before the putty dries, I use the Zimmerit tools to add the pattern. Again, I keep the tools damp with water to stop them from sticking. The tools are good, but it's a little bit hard to keep the pattern even around all of the details. Next I start improving the rear vents of the engine deck. I bought some wire mesh and cut it into shape, then glued it in position with superglue. The tank doesn't have any welds, but it does already have the gaps for me to apply them. Using the same 2-part putty, I created thin strands and tried to fit them into place. To be honest, I found it quite hard to get them to stay in position without getting them stuck to myself. Once they are in though, it's easy enough to add the weld texture. This was done with some thin bent metal from a drink can, gently pressed into the putty. To create the fenders, I cut out pieces from a copper sheet and bent them into shape with a PE bending tool. I added damage by bending the sheet with tweezers. I also added some bolt heads in the same place where the holders are. For the wooden block, I added a wood grain texture using the sharp end of some tweezers. To soften it, I used some extra thin glue. The kit comes with the crane for loading the huge rockets into the tank, but there is no holder. I used a spare part from my T-72 M4CZ to create this. Now the build is completed. Overall, I think it's okay, but there is a lot I would improve for next time. That's why I built this model, to practice those techniques and get better for my upcoming models. I'm interested to know what you would have done differently, so please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, then please consider liking and subscribing.